As part of Health by Design's ongoing commitment to behavioral health education, we present another lesson in our Fundamentals of Weight Management series. Here's the Medical Director of Health by Design, Dr. David Player.
Hello. Welcome to a lecture on physical fitness and its effects on our health. That may be an unusual thing for a doctor to be talking about. I think most of us had PE classes in grade school and junior high and high school, and for some of us that was our last contact with physical fitness. For the others of us who were athletes and played sports in high school and then went on to intramurals in college, perhaps we were physically fit and didn't know why we were or whether we were or not. And I guess my own personal experience is that's all I really learned about fitness. When I went to medical school, we didn't talk much about physical fitness. And it's only in the last 10 or 15 years that people have begun to be aware of the fact that physical fitness really is a medical issue and that doctors really should be talking about physical fitness. And there's some outstanding people in the country, Dr. Ken Cooper up in Dallas at the Aerobics Center, and Dr. Paffenbarger and Jim Fix, who, as we know, died not too long ago, men who spent their life telling people about the benefits of physical exercise and what it could do for people. And I think although most of our education in physical fitness comes from PE instructors and from fitness people in clubs and places like that, I think it's important for us to realize that this really is a medical issue, and that there are many, many medical papers that have now been written by outstanding people all over the world that would say that it is a great benefit to us medically to be physically fit. So that's really the reason that I, as a physician, am going to give you this lecture. I may not teach this quite the way an exercise physiologist might, or someone who runs a club might, but I'm going to tell you about the things that I think are important as a physician for you to know about physical fitness. Now, most of the things that I'm going to talk about here today are relating to something that's called aerobic fitness. And there are various kinds of fitness. There are really 4 or 5 major areas of fitness. One of them has to do with flexibility, how far you and I can sit and reach, or how far we can flex our neck or our lower spine, or how flexible are we in our hamstring muscles. And that's an element of fitness, and it is important, but it's something I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about today. There are other measures of fitness like strength. How much can you bench press is one of the standard measures of strength. And how much can you press with your leg muscles? That's another measure of strength. And those are important things because they relate to muscle mass, of course, and to leanness, both of which have biochemical things that help us with our problem with obesity. They may help us burn more calories and so forth. But I'm not going to spend much time, again, dealing with strength. And again, endurance is another measure of physical fitness. And we usually measure that by doing curl-ups. How many curl-ups can you do in a minute? It's a measure of a large muscle mass, your abdominal muscles, and how much of a certain timed activity you can do. And I'm not going to spend much time on that. I'm really going to look at this whole issue of what's called aerobic fitness, which has to do with heart and lung health. Because as a doctor who's taken care of thousands of people now who've died of atheromatous disease that we've talked about before, it just seems very important that we understand the benefits of aerobic fitness and aerobic health. Now, I've written over here on the board some of the known benefits from the medical literature of our being physically fit. I want you to look at them. You have them on your handout in front of you. First of all, it's been shown in a number of papers that there is a decreased death risk associated with physical fitness, and specifically aerobic fitness. The paper that we've quoted often before, both in our health risk appraisal lecture and then earlier in the lecture on cholesterol and heart disease, was a paper by Dr. Paffenbarger. And you'll remember that when it basically said that you and I have a certain death risk, and that for each calorie that we expend in exercise per week, there is a dropping death risk through 2,000 calories per week. And then after 2,000, it continues to improve, but less rapidly on out through 3,500 calories per week of exercise. So if you take 2 guys who are 60 years old, both of them are fat, both of them smoke, both of them had fathers who died of coronary disease in their 60s. They all have equal risk factors, but one guy plays tennis 6 days a week and the other guy does nothing. Believe it or not, the difference in death rate is about 50%. The guy who does nothing has 50 as low as 46% of the death rate of a guy who exercises regularly. So that's a very, very important thing. And there are at least 15 different papers in the medical literature, stuff that I read from the American Journal of Cardiology and the New England Journal of Medicine, that say that being physically fit is really important to us. So one of the first and the most important benefit to any physician is that his patients have a decreased death risk if they're physically fit. Some neat papers in the literature about depression and the treatment of anxiety and the handling of stress in animals and in human beings that are physically fit. There's one paper that now shows that people who are able to do 3,000 calories of physical exercise per week can be expected to have the same benefit as somebody who takes Elavil or Sinequan or one of the antidepressants. And in my own life, I know that I've had marked improvements in my ability to cope with stress, to handle the number of balls that are in the air, as I say, when I am physically fit. And I know after several weeks of not exercising how bad I feel and how important it is. And a number of papers have shown that quantitatively, that it's very, very important that one exercise physically. Of course, all of us are aware that physical fitness has an impact on obesity and on lean mass. When we talked way back at the beginning in lecture number 1 about what you and I can do to increase our muscle mass, we remember that I said any woman in the audience, by lifting 5-pound dumbbells over and over again, will have a bigger biceps when she's done, if she eats adequate amounts of protein. And most of you have documented that in your life. Well, of course, increased physical exercise leads to our becoming increasingly lean, which is another definition of decreased obesity. Now, it's important for us to remember here, though, and I always tell people, a good way to treat obesity is not with fitness. And the example of that, of course, is remember that it takes 3,500 calories of burned off energy to lose 1 pound of fat. Now, just to give you an example, for a man who weighs 150 pounds, walking or jogging 1 mile burns about 100 calories. 150-pound man, 100 calories. Well, a woman or a man who weighs 150 pounds would, of course, have to walk 35 miles to lose 1 pound of fat. As I said, a lady came into my office not long ago and says, "Doctor, I need to lose 15 pounds in the next 2 weeks by the time of my daughter's wedding. What can I do?" And I said, well, she said, "I really need to get going with my exercise, don't I?" And I said, "Yeah, you need to walk to Houston and back if you're going to lose that amount of weight in that short amount of time." And we see how difficult it is just to lose fat by exercising. And yet it is one of the hallmarks of learning to live at a new weight, which is what most of you are already doing at this point. Many of you are trying to learn to live at a new weight. And physical exercise is obviously of very great importance, because if you and I can add 300 or 400 calories a day of physical activity to what we do, that's 300 or 400 more calories that you and I can eat. Now, there's a number of papers that show that people who are physically fit have increased work effectiveness. A number of big companies, Tenneco was one of the first ones that did a controlled study on their employees who had physical fitness as part of their work activity. And they had on-site programs in aerobic dance and in weightlifting and jogging and treadmill work and so forth. And those people had a marked increase in their work effectiveness. They had better work attendance, fewer days missed from work, and in general, productivity of the entire company increased. And there are a number of corporations that are now looking into that. It doesn't mean that your company is going to make millions more dollars, but in terms of lost days and sick days and things like that, and employees feeling good about themselves, it is clear that aerobic fitness increases work effectiveness. Here's one that's important to all of us, maybe not as important to some of you as others, but increased sexual activity has been demonstrated in a number of studies, both in animals and in human beings, when they're physically fit. And as has libido, interest in sexual things. And it's well known, again, that fat guys who are out of shape are less likely to be interested in sex or have a less good concept of themselves physically. And physical activity, again, improves sexual performance in a number of studies. There are a number of laboratory data that improve when we're physically active, and we've talked about some of those in other lectures. The most important of those, remember that one of the most significant things we can do to increase our high-density lipoproteins, the HDL cholesterol, if you remember from lecture 7, one of the most important ways to manipulate that is by becoming physically active. And remember I told you that it had to be aerobic type activity, repetitive activity at a constant rate that kept our heart beating at a certain rate. And if we did that, our HDLs would slowly rise. And our cholesterol, our total cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, would come on down slowly at the same time. So that's one of the things that changes. Another parameter that changes is our blood sugar. People who are diabetic and get increased physical activity have been shown to have much better control of their blood sugar, and dropping insulin requirements for diabetics and dropping insulin levels in the blood of people who are not diabetic when they become physically fit. So all of those are very important benefits, and there are a host of others that have been shown in the medical literature to be important. Now, if indeed it's true that physical fitness then does all of this stuff and can make us be healthier and live longer and so forth, it's important for us then to have a good concept of what physical fitness is. And I suspect our kids in college and high school and grade school are learning that better than we did, because maybe some of the data wasn't even there, and men like Ken Cooper have spent their lives collecting data on people and showing what kind of activity is important and what is fitness anyway. And I guess to me as a doctor, physical fitness can best be defined as how many heartbeats and how many breaths does it take you to go do something. If you and I have to go over and pick up a pencil over there, how many heartbeats is it going to take for you? How many breaths are you going to have to do to go do that? That's the best measure of fitness. And there's data to show that, for instance, after a heart attack, that guys who've had heart attacks survive better if they're physically fit. And what that's really saying is the heart is trained to live with less oxygen. It can use oxygen more efficiently and so forth. So fitness then is a measure of how many heartbeats and how many breaths it takes you and me to go do things. And when we're more physically fit, it takes fewer heartbeats and fewer breaths to accomplish a similar task. Now what we're saying then is it's a measure of oxygen consumption, and that physically fit people, when doing some activity, can use more oxygen at slower heart rates and slower amounts of breathing than people who aren't physically fit. The components of aerobic fitness then, of our ability to measure what really happens inside our body, two of the things obviously that happen are that when we're fit are that our pulse slows down and our rate of breathing slows down for doing some certain activity. Now there are about 5 or 6 things that you can measure over time that change when you and I become physically fit. One of them is our cardiac output. Our heart, the amount of blood our heart pumps per minute can rise when we become physically fit. Secondly, the amount of air that our lungs can breathe in a minute rises when we are physically fit. Lung volumes go up. The amount of blood that we make, our blood volume, how many blood cells, rises in very physically fit people. And finally, the amount of oxygen that moves from lungs into blood goes up, the amount of oxygen that moves from blood into muscles goes up, and the rate at which the mitochondria inside the muscle cells use oxygen goes up. Those are the major things that change when we become physically fit. Well, the next question you probably have is, well, how do we become physically fit? What do you do? How do you become physically fit? Because obviously these are all things that you and I would want to have if we could medically. We've already been looking at all these things in the laboratory that are so important, and if we could, it'd be nice to be physically fit. How do we do it? Well, you have to undergo something that's called training. And training has been looked at carefully in places like the Aerobics Center in Dallas and in Dr. Paffenbarger's laboratory and others. And basically what's been shown is that you and I must do a kind of activity that increases our pulse into a certain range for a certain number of minutes per week. And it varies from person to person, but basically what Dr. Cooper has shown in Dallas is that for every human being at a given age, there is a maximal pulse that you and I can get our heart beating to. And that would be the best way to do that. There are all sorts of formulas, but the easiest way is to take 220 and subtract your age, and you'll come up with a number. Now for me, for instance, that 220 minus my age is about 177. And I know when I get on a maximal treadmill that my pulse can get to about 180, and that's all I can do. Now interestingly, my kids can get their pulse up over 200 still, and that fits with this formula. Women can perhaps get their pulses a little faster than men, and physically fit people can perhaps get their pulses just a little bit faster as they become more physically fit. But we can usually use this kind of a formula to determine the max pulse that we can expect to have as a human being. Well, now what Dr. Cooper has shown, and I know you've probably heard some of this stuff before, but bear with me because it's important to hear it again, that if we exercise in a range as a percentage of this total, we can become increasingly fit. All of those things that I talked about before. Increasing cardiac output, increased lung volumes, better movement of oxygen across tissues, increased blood volume, that all of those things improve if we exercise in a pulse range that's known as the training range, or your training zone. And these are things that are now commonly taught by exercise physiologists and people at health clubs and so forth. But your training range officially, at least for me as a doctor, is between 60 and 85% of maximal pulse. So if you know your maximal pulse is 180 beats per minute, then your training range is going to be between 60 and 85% of that. Or for a man my age, it's between about 125 and 148 beats per minute. Or it was the last time I calculated it. So if, Dr. Cooper says, if I get my pulse into this range with whatever kind of activity I'm doing, whether I'm crawling or rolling around or walking or whatever the heck it is I'm doing, if my pulse gets up to that level and it stays there for a period of time, I will gradually become physically fit by all those measures that we already talked about. I hope everyone kind of understands that. Now, the next question is, well, what kind of activity can make you do that? And the truth is that almost anything you and I do can raise our pulse into that level. The problem with so many kinds of activity, like various sports and games we play, is that our heart will get up into that range or even faster than that for a period of time, and then it'll drop back down there. For instance, tennis. Even when I played singles tennis to pace myself, and I played lots and lots of singles tennis, I would run very rapidly for a while after the ball, and then I'd rest between points. I'd hit a ball into the net and walk up and pick it up and so forth. Maybe my pulse during that time that I was walking to pick up the ball might be 95, and while I was chasing balls back and forth from baseline to baseline, it might be 170. Well, that's kind of an aerobic activity, and it depends on how much time you waste talking between points, of course. What Dr. Cooper has said is that it's ideal for you and me to get a training effect that our pulse would stay between this 125 and 148 for 20 minutes. And he further said that you need to do it a minimum of 3 times a week, and it's probably better if you do it 5 or 6 times a week, keeping your pulse in that zone. So all you and I have to be able to figure out is what kinds of activities should we do, and how many calories does it expend, and so forth, and can I keep my pulse up in this zone for a prolonged period of time. One of the things that's been shown, of course, is that if one does that, your death rate will drop. And as a doctor, I'm here in this lecture series to tell you that what we're after, of course, is health risk appraisals with zeros over on the side, dropping death rates because of behaviors. And this is a very, very important thing for us to do. Now, it's important also for us to know how many calories we expend, because Dr. Paffenbarger has shown that with each expended calorie per week in some kind of activity, and in Paffenbarger's study, which I think I've given you copies of, Paffenbarger showed that it didn't really make too much difference what kind of activity it was. He looked at light sports, at heavy sports, at stair climbing, at walking, at various kinds of things, and then he looked at all calories expended. So we need to get a concept of what kinds of activities burn what kind of calories per week. But we also need to have a feeling for how fast does our pulse go during that activity. Does everyone understand that? Okay, it's important. Both of those things are important, and they're looking at 2 different items. One of them is looking at decreased death rate because of calories expended. The other one is looking at physical fitness, aerobic fitness, which also affects death rate. So I guess my reading of Paffenbarger's paper is that probably people who have aerobic fitness do a better job of decreasing death rate than people who do other kinds of activity and are not aerobic. But it's important also to know that if you and I crawl 3 miles, we will burn the same number of calories as a guy who walks 3 miles. The calories are still burned, and calories expended are important, particularly for those of us with too much body fat who are trying to control our body composition by exercising. Now, what do we need to do then? We need to learn the calories in some activities that we would do ordinarily. And I think that it doesn't make any difference for me to know how many calories a guy gets playing broom ball, because I don't play broom ball. And there are many kinds of activity charts around, and you have some of them in front of you, and I want you to learn the calories in the activity that you are most likely to do. As a doctor, I'm really into people picking activities that orthopedically don't hurt you, and picking activities that you can do for the rest of your life. It makes no sense for a guy on a diet to pump iron all day long trying to lose weight and then stop it when he's done. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any sense for a guy to burn 7,000 calories a week of exercise while he's on his diet and then go to 2,000 calories of exercise later. That's senseless. You have to pick an activity level and a kind of activity that you can do for the rest of your life. And then after you've picked that kind of activity and you've picked the level, you need to be able to monitor for a while what is your pulse at a given workload in that activity. And if your pulse is in this training zone while you're doing it, then that's a good activity for you. Now, I guess my other concern, of course, is that there are many activities that are orthopedically bad. How many times we've seen guys trudging down the road out there, some 240-pound guy trucking on down the road, and you can just see that guy's knees and his low back begging for mercy, and yet he's saying to himself, man, I got to get out on the road and I got to do it. I got to keep jogging because that's good for me. I can lose more weight. Well, first of all, we've seen before that isn't a good way to lose weight in the first place, and orthopedically I think it's criminal for a guy who's that heavy to go pounding down the road as his principal means of getting aerobic activity. It may be fine for him to run sometimes, but I think we've got to pick activity that we can do forever. Begin to get up and go walk somewhere. Because you have to walk to the John when you're 85 years old still. You don't have to row to the John, you don't have to ride a bike to the John, you don't have to crawl to the John, or you might have to, but at least you have to be walking to wherever you go. And I think walking is a wonderful activity. It's more time consuming than jogging, but it is a very, very good activity because it orthopedically is not very stressful compared to, say, jogging or compared to running on various kinds of machinery or playing sports of various kinds. And the older we get, the more important it is that we become aerobically fit, but the more important it is that we not have injuries. And how many guys do you know who ran 4 miles a day and then they had a knee injury or a back injury and they were done? They didn't know what else to do. And they got fat and got out of shape and finally had a heart attack. That's not a good story. You want to pick an activity that you can do today, tomorrow, 10 years from now, 20 years from now that makes sense to you, and do it. And do it the same week after week after week. And then you'd like to know that that activity can get your pulse into an aerobic training range where you're improving your cardiac output and your breathing capacity and your blood volume and all this movement of oxygen that I talked about. Some people like to use pulse monitors, aerobic pulse monitors now. There are a number of companies that make them in price ranges all the way from $30 on up to $200 or $300, and you can actually wear a telemetry monitor on your chest that sends messages to a watch. And they're kind of fun for you to look at what your pulse is at various times on your walk or various times on your jog. But the truth is that most of us, even without those, have a pretty good idea after a while what our pulse is. And women in aerobics classes especially are taught to take their pulse here after various kinds of activity and see if they are aerobic, if they're in their zone. Now people have asked, well, what happens if I'm out of my zone, if I'm at a pulse of 160? Is that bad for me? And my answer is no, it's not bad for you. I suspect that the guys that you and I watch playing football on Sunday afternoon on TV are spending a portion of their time up in what I call an anaerobic zone, a zone where they're not getting enough oxygen per minute. I know that doesn't hurt people to do that, but in good studies in the aerobic center at Dallas and other places, you can't become more aerobically fit if you are exercising most of the time in an anaerobic zone where you're using a different kind of metabolism, nor can you become aerobically fit when you're exercising with a pulse that's too slow. So I think that it's fun to play sports, it's fun to play games, it's fun to do all of those things that are joys to us in life, and we shouldn't stop doing those, but for our aerobic activity that's for us, for our heart, for keeping down depression, for improving sexual activity, for making our HDLs get better, for all of those health, wellness related things, we probably should pick an activity that gets us into our pulse range constantly. I usually like to talk about my own activity, my wife's activity. For years I was a jogger. I was one of those guys who pounded down the road and I ran my miles. I'd finish up hustling in at the end, running my last 300 yards as fast as I could, and I'd come in with a red face and I'd hurt for a while. And to tell you the truth, I can't tell you that I ever liked it very much, even after 10 years of doing it. And I had an injury to my knee then, and my back began to hurt, and I began to get into this whole literature of what should we be doing? Why the heck should I be out there on the road anyway? Is that really what I need to do, or could I crawl around on the floor all day long and have the same kind of activity? And the more I read and the more I understood this stuff and this whole issue of how does one become fit, and then saw Dr. Paffenbarger's data about calories per week and death rates from cancer and heart disease and all this stuff, it became apparent that I needed to pick some kind of activity that I could do forever, something that got me aerobic and kept me aerobic for quite a long time. And it made sense to me that the best activity that I could do was walking. And so several years ago I started walking. Now the first thing I noticed, of course, was when I first started walking, because I was kind of physically fit from years of jogging, my pulse only got to about 100. And that was frustrating to me, because to get my pulse up to 130 where I wanted to be, or 140, I had to walk like crazy. I had to walk so fast that I was almost race walking, and that isn't fun. You start hurting down here in your fronts of your tibial areas, and it's really a hustle to race walk. It's a fun activity if you like to do it, but I'm not really hot for race walking. So then I got the idea. I read a book by a neat guy who talked about walking with weights, and I began carrying weights. Well, lo and behold, the more I lifted, when I began lifting these little 3-pound weights this high, wouldn't you believe, my pulse went up to 150, and it stayed at 150. In fact, I knew every bush along my route because I used to have to dump the weights off on the side. And as time went on, I got better and better, and my pulse slowly came down. Would you believe, after about 2 months of walking with 3-pound weights like this, and walking along at a rate of, say, 15 minutes a mile, my pulse had dropped back down in the 120s. I was becoming physically fit. I was beginning to understand all this stuff about fitness. Now, when I got to feeling better and my upper body felt better and the muscles started to grow and so forth, I said, gee, I think I can go up to 5 pounds. So I began walking with 5 pounds. Same rate. First time I walked, I was exhausted. I couldn't even go 3 miles with them this high. I had to carry them down at my sides by the end of the walk. And my pulse was 155. I just couldn't believe it. My pulse was back up. I was pushing myself to a workload that took me out of my aerobic range. Well, I gradually lowered them down, and over the next 2 or 3 months, believe it or not, my pulse gradually came back down to 125 again, and I was able to finish my walk feeling terrific. Felt like I'd had a wonderful aerobic activity. And I eventually moved up to 7.5 pounds, and for the last 3 or 4 years I've been walking with 7.5 pounds, just carrying little dumbbells. So there may be other activities that are good for you. Maybe you like to ride bicycles long distances. Maybe you like to jog. Maybe you like to row boats. Maybe you like to work out in a fitness club. But I think you've got to pick things that don't have to take you to a club, because you and I will have 1,000 reasons why we can't get to the club tonight. You need to pick things that you can do come rain or shine. You need to maybe have a treadmill at home or some kind of a machine that allows you to keep exercising and keep being aerobic. You need to have a plan when you have an injury. If you can't walk or you can't run, maybe you can row. Maybe you can do a bicycle. Maybe you can do some of that stuff. But you have to do something that gets your pulse up into a training range and keeps it there for a prolonged period of time. Obviously, the bottom line for this whole thing is better health and a longer life. And I want you to realize again that it's fun to play games and it's fun to play sports, and you and I haven't had a whole lot of teaching about this for many years. But it's now been shown by authorities all over the world in medical papers, good medical journals, that physical fitness enhances life quality, increases our ability to cope with stress, increases our lean tissue, decreases obese tissue, increases work effectiveness, increases sexual activity. All of these things get better when we become physically fit. And the bottom line is better health and longer life. I know there's some questions about this, and I'm not an exercise physiologist, and I'm certainly not a guru in fitness. I love to be physically fit. It makes me feel better. I'm in the depths when I'm not, and I've had all kinds of problems coping with life. But I can only tell you from personal experience that being physically fit is a great thing, and I encourage each of you to get some kind of activity, to expend more and more calories in a way that fits with your lifestyle, and do things that don't hurt your bodies, but get into this whole concept of why am I doing what I'm doing, and I know you're really going to be happy. And furthermore, you're going to be able to live with this whole issue of learning to live at a new weight, which of course is the reason that you came in here. Thanks so much, and we'll talk later.